and welcome back to episode 12 of the Asian Peace Talks, a podcast launched by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. I'm Kishore Mahbubani, the host of the Asian Peace Talks. For this episode, we are delighted to interview Professor David Kang, the Maria Crutcher Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. Professor Kang is a recognized expert on Korean studies and international relations of East Asia. He has written important books on the subject, including East Asia Before the West, 5 Centuries of Trade and Tribute, and Beyond Power Transitions, The Lessons of East Asian History and the Future of U.S.-China Relations, both published by Columbia University Press in 2012 and 2024, respectively. More recently, of course, David, you have published articles also in Foreign Affairs and International Security, I believe. And let me just explain the goal of this podcast. To many Asians outside Northeast Asia, it's very, very puzzling that even though culturally, I mean, China, Japan, South Korea are relatively quite close. They have common Confucian roots, Taoist roots, Buddhist roots. And yet, those 3 countries cannot cooperate regionally or set up an association of Northeast Asian nations. I call it ANIAN. Even though Southeast Asia, which is far more diverse, very, very diverse,
Yes.
and where among the 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists. Then we have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and lots of communists too in Southeast Asia. And we get along.
Yeah.
So the question is, why doesn't Northeast Asia get along? That's the goal of this podcast, to answer that question. But we're going to go sequentially. First, we're going to talk a bit about the longer history of the region to see what may be behind some of the current difficulties, and then we move on to the present, and hopefully talk about the future too. So this will be like a 3-part podcast. And thank you, David, for joining us this morning. So let me begin with the first question about the past. This podcast episode is entitled, "Can East Asia Reconcile with Itself?" This is not an outlandish question. East Asia has a centuries-long history of trade, cultural exchanges, and largely peaceful relations within Japan and China, Japan and Korea, especially if you look at over the last 1,000 years. However, this history of relative peace took a turn during the brutal late 19th to early 20th century. A newly militarized Japan colonized Korea and Manchuria. The Japanese invasion of China, which in many ways started World War II, was among the most brutal military assaults in modern history. And since then, the China-Japan relationship has never returned to its pre-19th century stability. So can you outline for us very, very briefly, because I know it's a long history, David, what relations were like among the 3 bilateral relationships between Korea and Japan, Japan and China and Korea? How would you describe the historical relationships?
First of all, thank you for having me so much. I'm delighted to be here. It's delighted to meet you. So it's my honor to be invited. And you have, of course, asked the questions where if I had an answer, we would already be doing something about it. But the historical relations over the last, say, starting 700 AD, with the sort of a rise of what might be called centralized Japanese rule, was always focused on a Chinese civilization. And so, in many ways, China as the source of ideas, and as you said, sort of Confucianism, Buddhism, all that stuff came through China to Korea and then Japan. And so relations were largely those, if they weren't outright sort of hierarchic tribute relations, were certainly within a Chinese civilizational world. There was really no other alternative ideas out there. And so Korea and Japan have grown up, evolved over the last 1,300 years with Chinese civilization as its sort of core, whether it's language, poetry, the kinds of history and the ideas, the metaphors they use are very much Chinese civilization, along with indigenous roots. And so there wasn't a whole lot of fighting among these countries. There was a lot of cultural flows, fair amount of trade. Japan one time tried to invade Korea and China in 1592.
Hmm.
One time, the Mongols
Hmm.
tried to invade Japan back in 1271. Right, so we have centuries in between fighting between these countries. Um, and so that's basically the way that these countries have sort of evolved, their societies have grown up over the last 1,000 years. And that changed with the arrival of the West. And as you said, Japan's industrialization and militarization. But
Hmm.
before then, relations were fairly stable between the three countries.
Hmm. Yeah, but the question, therefore, is Ezra Vogel, as you know, says in his book, China and Japan, that China and Japan have the longest recorded history of any two countries in diplomatic history for 1,500 years. In other words, 1,500 years, they live at peace for 1,450 years. So,
Yeah.
how do you explain that relative peace for so long, say,
Yeah.
between China and Japan? What were
Yeah.
the roots of that relative peace for so long?
Yeah. And you can include Korea in that as well. The
Yeah.
Korean kingdoms, again, 400 or 500 AD,
Mm,
all had tribute relations with the Tang dynasty in China. They knew about the Japanese ones. They went back and forth, right? So these are countries that have long histories of getting along. In
mm,
large part, it's sort of like the other side of having
mm,
one dominant hegemonic power
mm,
is that the Chinese did not view these countries as Chinese.
mm,
They viewed them as something different.
mm,
They didn't have any particular desire to conquer these countries that were,
mm,
frankly, very peripheral to China.
mm,
And these smaller countries, Japan and Korea, didn't have any particular designs of trying to conquer
mm,
China.
mm,
I mean, that way of thinking is almost impossible to put
mm,
back on those.
mm,
It was incredibly rare to think that you were
mm.
going to do that. So
Yeah,
the exception was the one or two times that they
yeah,
fought, but it was really unthinkable. These were
yeah,
kingdoms that were remarkably stable, if you think about it. And I'll
yeah,
give you one example of that. They talk in Korea about one thing that you can do is you can look at tombs like
yeah,
king's tombs and things like that from 1,500 years ago because nobody ever conquered them and they didn't dig these things
yeah,
up,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
There's so much stability that it's hard to imagine in, say,
yeah,
for example, other places of the world where you get looted all the time.
yeah. Yeah. So I think, so that leads me to say something maybe slightly provocative and slightly controversial. It's interesting that Japan, for example, lived in peace with both China and South Korea. But when Japan became the first Asian country to modernize, and the way they modernized, of course, was by learning from the West, which was the right thing to do, the Meiji reformers. But unfortunately, they also, when they learned from the West, they also inherited some kind of militaristic culture that wasn't Japanese but came from the West. And so they decided that if the Europeans can go around conquering the world, why shouldn't they conquer Korea? Why shouldn't they conquer Manchuria? So, was that possibly the trigger that changed the more traditional dynamic of peaceful coexistence between China, Japan, and Korea?
Well, I that is provocative. I would certainly say that I think the arrival of the West changed almost everything, right?
Hmm.
One of the sort of misnomers we have about Japanese history, which comes to us from movies, is
Hmm.
that it was constant feudal warfare.
Hmm.
That's all the movies are like these various, Japanese shoguns and daimyos fighting. But that was actually a very relatively narrow band of time,
Hmm.
1400 to around 1600.
Hmm. Yeah.
Before then, you didn't have a feudal warlord era,
Hmm.
and you didn't have it afterward. So
Hmm.
centralized rule is actually typical in Japan as well as it was in Korea and China, right? It wasn't this feudal
Hmm.
war of all against all, the
Yeah.
warring states era. So
Hmm.
yeah, it wasn't a natural idea that okay, well, the minute we get strong, we're going to invade.
Hmm.
What the way I tend to think about it is that like with the sort of arrival of the West in the 1900s, 1800s,
Yeah.
1850s,
Yeah.
yes, the Japanese thought their only way to survive was
Hmm.
to become a great power like the Western powers.
Hmm.
And among that was obviously industrialization,
mm,
capitalism, all these things, militarization.
mm,
And what do great powers do is they create colonies.
mm,
And so they went out and decided that they were going to create a sort of
mm,
ring of colonies that were going to be a buffer zone. And so I
mm,
think that's very much a
mm,
Western product.
mm.
And you find the
Yeah.
Japanese right now trying to say we're honorary West
Mm.
in
Yes.
ways I don't think Koreans and Chinese don't at
Yeah.
all have that,
That's right. Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's always clear that things change after the arrival of the West. Okay, David, really thank you for that historical overview. Now, I'd like to sort of fast forward to the present, and it's sort of strange that, the three countries, there are three sets of troubled relationships now between Korea and Japan, South Korea and Japan, South Korea and China, China and
Yeah.
Japan. So
Yeah.
what would you say are the key ingredients that explain the somewhat fraught relations between the three bilateral relationships? We can start in any order: China and South Korea, China and Japan,
Yeah.
Japan and South Korea. Then
Yeah.
in each case, I think there's some particular elements that cause the difficulties. What would you highlight?
Oh, yeah. Right. I mean, as you said, one of the things that makes this so interesting is these countries do share cultural, sort of religious. There aren't these kinds of schisms that you would normally think cause the
Mm,
friction,
mm,
right? Um, it's not a religious friction. There's not a cultural, differences and things like that. Um, Certainly, there is this question of Japan's role of 50 to 100 years ago. And what's interesting is that as we go around and around about this, where people will say, "Well, Japan has apologized," and then
mm.
somebody pops up like a prime minister who says, "Well, we didn't do anything any wrong anyway," and people
Yeah,
are
yeah,
like, "I knew it. I knew you
yeah,
weren't sincere,"
yeah, yeah.
right? um, and I get how
Can
Japanese
you,
are.
can
So
you,
they,
if you don't mind, sorry to interrupt you,
yeah,
just very briefly, why do the Japanese have a very difficult time apologizing in the
yeah,
way that Germany could apologize very deeply and
yeah.
sincerely after World War II? What's that cultural problem there?
I I do not have a good answer to that because
Wow.
I think many Japanese truly wouldn't have wanted to get into the war,
Uh,
don't think about that time era any more than we
mm,
might think about things that were done a couple
mm,
generations ago, right? And are totally fine with it. I don't think this is a national issue,
mm,
but there is certainly an element in the political or the social sphere which is
mm,
um, you know deeply sort of unrepentant in a way.
mm,
um, and it is an issue, right? I think one of the problems is all of these countries have issues in their recent history
mm,
that are very difficult to deal with.
mm,
In Korea, it's the military governments and the
mm,
things that happen there. Some awful things there. Obviously, in China, there's
mm,
a reckoning with what the Communist Party did that nobody's
mm,
ever going to go. No one
mm,
wants to go close to. So they all have difficulties with their history.
mm,
In Japan, in particular, I think it's there's a lot of things about Japan that are interesting. The LDP has been in power for decades, and
mm,
despite very slow growth and almost no reforms, they're still in power. So
mm,
there are things about contemporary Japanese politics that are very stable, and in some ways, I think keep Japan from moving forward, both in good and bad ways, right?
mm,
Um, and so I don't have a good answer for why there's such trouble with these things, but there is definitely a feeling
mm,
that most people are fine, but you put people in power who are going to
mm,
say these things, and then they go say those things, and we're like,
mm.
aha, I knew all along.
Yeah. Yeah, here I'm going to also say something that may be slightly provocative. My sense is that this reluctance to apologize is actually more embedded in the elite, many of whom, I'll give you an example, Prime Ministers Abe, father, grandfather were in some
Hmm.
respect involved in the war.
Yeah,
And, Japanese family traditions are very important. And so I could understand why Prime Minister Abe could feel that his father and grandfather were wronged. But
yeah,
I think that's not true of the population at large in Japan.
yeah,
the people at large actually are not that committed to World War II and would rather apologize and close the chapter. Would you say
Yeah.
that that's true of the Japanese people at large?
That's exactly sort of the point that I was trying to make. Is I think the vast majority of people are ready to move on,
Hmm.
and that there's some political capital to be made by a certain segment of the population,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and that's where we are.
Yeah. And in the case of Japan and South Korea, as you know, the United States treats them as two of its key allies. And say under Joe Biden, certainly under Kurt Campbell, they made a massive effort to sort of get a full historic reconciliation between South Korea and Japan. But despite the hard work of Kurt Campbell, the mission failed essentially. So why
Yeah,
did it fail? Why did the United States not succeed in overcoming the historical divisions within Japan and South Korea?
yeah. Well, first, I don't think the Americans are in a position to force it. Right? I
Mm,
mean, this isn't something where a couple of elites show up and start lecturing Koreans.
mm,
Mostly, what's interesting about that is mostly it's considered to be the Koreans who are the ones that are stubborn.
mm,
But then it's every now and then it's the Japanese, the new prime minister comes in and then repeats exactly what the Koreans were worried about they were going to say, right?
mm,
So it's not like Kurt Campbell can force that. Uh, the other side, the other interesting thing about that is that the U.S. continually says to particularly the Korean in a way that I find again, I don't know, gallingly condescending
mm,
is the Americans will go to the Koreans and say, "You don't understand. Japan's your friend. You should be worried about China,"
mm.
as if the Koreans are too dumb to know what their own interests are.
Uh,
And that type of pressure, I mean, Yoon Sung Yeol, the previous Korean president, was
mm,
as right wing as you were going to get. He was
mm,
as pro US as you were going to get. And he did
mm,
all that stuff to try and reconcile with Japan, but
mm,
he still wasn't willing to turn and take on China
mm,
because that's not what the Koreans think. They are not. They are not going to simply
mm,
contain China and do all that kind of stuff. So Korea is in a very different place than
mm,
Americans think it should be.
mm,
And what I try and tell the Americans all the time, or my colleagues, is like, Korea shares some, but not all American priorities. And the idea that they're going to
mm,
contain China is not going to happen. So
mm.
what the Americans want with Japan and Korea is very different than the reality of where a Korea and
Right.
even a
Yeah.
Japan is,
Yeah.
right?
But I'm glad you highlighted the American dimension and the American role because I think United States in many ways can play a helpful role between China and Japan and South Korea, but I mean at least between Japan and South Korea.
Yeah.
But this requires at the same time a kind of deep historical sensitivity on the part of the United States. And do you think that exists among the US establishment? Is there a deep understanding of the historical challenges that have to be overcome? For example, in the Japan-Korea relationship.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that even some of people who are very close friends of mine have a very America-centric view of what Korea and Japan's role should
Mm,
be. And
mm,
that involves, as I said, trying to get Koreans to realize what their interests are. Like, don't you
mm,
understand?
mm,
Um, and you see now there's sort of a more of a progressive or leftist South Korean president who wants everybody wants good relations with the United States.
mm,
But no Korean president is going to be as uh, anti-China as the Americans want, and that sets up a problem. Even the Japanese, it'll be so interesting to see the new prime minister in Japan, who's
mm,
talking a very tough line,
mm,
whether she can do it herself, whether the country's going to go there, because they've been talking doubling the defense since Abe for
mm,
5, 10 years. They've been talking about
mm,
doubling defense spending, and it hasn't happened.
mm,
So we'll see whether this one is any different or not. The talk may be more harsh. Is
mm,
Japan as a society, is the LDP as a government going to move?
mm,
They
mm.
haven't in the past,
Yes. So
right? And so,
how do you explain what happened? I mean, since we are doing this podcast on 19 November, as you know, relations between Japan and China
oh,
have taken another nosedive,
yeah,
which has happened so many times, by the way. Uh,
yeah.
uh, why exactly did you think, what was going on in the mind of Prime Minister Takeuchi? Did I pronounce the name correctly?
Takaichi, yeah, right.
Takaichi, yeah.
Yeah.
What was going on in her? what were the strategic calculations in her mind as she decided to say that, if there's a war over Taiwan, Japan has to
Yeah.
intervene? Why did she have to say that?
I actually don't know
Hmm.
because the previous prime minister had
Anyway,
walked
David, if you
back.
if you don't know, who can know?
I know, right? Because to me, it seemed like, right? It seemed like that the new prime minister had come in. She had always been saying this kind of stuff, right? So it's
Yeah,
not a surprise.
yeah.
And then came in determined to start immediately. I mean,
Mm,
within weeks of becoming prime minister,
mm,
start laying down her markers as to what the new appearance was going to be,
mm,
um, in ways that are demonstrably not helping Japan.
mm,
And it's not just with China and her claims that we'll get involved in a war over
mm.
Taiwan.
Yeah.
Um, as we were talking earlier, it's Japan, not Korea, but Japan has suspended joint military exercises with Korean fighters because the
Mm,
Korean fighters go over the disputed islands of
yeah.
Dokdo,
Yeah.
right? And it's like this is so self-defeating. It's not the Koreans, it's the Japanese who are saying you
Yeah.
can't do that, right?
Yeah.
So they're taking a much harder line, and I think making it worse on themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, which is in contrast to the Korean. The Korean president, when asked if he would get involved in a war over Taiwan,
Mm,
Lee Jae-myung said, "I'll think about that when aliens invade."
mm.
Right? Meaning, I'm not getting near that question. And if aliens come
Yeah.
down, then we'll
Yeah.
worry about that issue, right? Which
Yeah.
is very much a Korean attitude, right? They do not want to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think, the new Japanese prime minister was there trying to set down the marker and see what happened. And in
Yeah.
some ways, the Chinese sort of fell for it,
Yeah.
but
What's interesting is that the United States still has a policy of strategic ambiguity, which
yeah,
I think is the right thing to have,
yes,
on
yes,
Taiwan.
yeah,
And yet the Japanese Prime Minister doesn't seem to be aware of that policy of strategic ambiguity and how it served Japanese interests uh,
yeah,
to do that. Just as United States plays a very critical role in this trilateral relationship within China, Japan, South Korea, another country also has an effect on the trilateral relationship. Of course, and that's North Korea. So North Korea, of course, ensures that South Korea will always have a defense alliance with the United States. But North Korea also ensures that South Korea has an interest in keeping good ties with China because they know that China at the end of the day has some degree of, at least influence or connectivity with North Korea. So how does the North Korean dimension affect the relations among these three countries?
yeah. What's the big tragedy of Northeast Asia? There's a number of puzzles about Northeast Asia,
Yeah,
right? As you said, Southeast Asia is more diverse, yet has ASEAN, and North Asia
yeah.
doesn't. The other one is that, for as bad as China-Taiwan relations are,
Mm,
in the last 50 years, they have improved remarkably compared to where
mm,
they were. You can
yes.
go back and forth, you can trade, you can call, you can visit. The
Yeah,
tragedy is South and North Korea has not moved since 1945.
yeah,
There's been no change, basically,
yeah,
except now they have nuclear weapons,
yeah.
right? So it's sort of frozen and stuck, not
Mm.
just sort of
And
Japan
there's
from World
no
War
there's
II.
no there's no cross-border movement, cross-border trade, right? Whereas by
Nothing.
contrast, you're right, between China and Taiwan, there's a tremendous amount of
Yeah.
trade and tremendous amount of people flows and capital flows.
Yes. Yes. Investment, tourism,
Yeah.
travel. There was a little bit 20
Mm-hmm.
years ago between North and South Korea, but it's essentially zero now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you certainly can't go. You
Mm-hmm.
can't visit, right? So it
Yeah.
was some trade, right? Indirect trade. So
Yeah.
it's a tragedy. But what North Korea does in some ways is freezes everything. Because
Mm.
as you said, South Korea's main security concern will always be North Korea.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine anything, as long as North Korea is there, that's what will be it's South
Mm.
Korea's primary focus.
Mm.
Um, Even if North Korea disappeared, it's hard to imagine a Korea being afraid of China,
Yeah.
frankly. I mean, they've spent centuries next to a big China. They know how to live with a big China.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the North Korea issue
Mm.
freezes all the countries there in a
Mm.
way that we all know the region would be better if North Korean problem were solved.
Yeah. Yeah, I must say, by the way, that one of the boldest and most innovative things that President Trump did in his first term was to talk to North Korea. I
Yes.
always say, as someone who was a diplomat for 33 years, diplomacy was invented 2,000 years ago, not to enable you to talk to your friends, but to
Yeah.
enable you to talk to your enemies, because you
Yeah.
need diplomatic immunity only when you talk to your enemy. So the United States has, in a very curious way, inverted all this and said they would not establish diplomatic relations with North Korea until North Korea becomes a friend. Excuse me, you don't
Yeah.
need diplomatic relations with friends. You
Yeah.
need diplomatic relations with enemies.
Yeah.
And I thought Donald Trump did the right thing in talking to North Korea. So do you see any possibility of him doing so again this time around?
Well, first, I agree with you 100%.
Mm,
And I've said that repeatedly, that I think one of the biggest missed opportunities
mm,
was when Trump talked to Kim Jong Un, and Kim Jong Un was willing to negotiate stuff.
mm.
And they met in Hanoi. I mean, first in Singapore, but then in
Yeah.
Hanoi. And that we didn't take, I would take any deal. Imagine what was on part of the deal, what was on up
Mm,
for grabs was dismantling the Yongbyon nuclear facility, which is where
mm.
they make plutonium.
Yeah.
Now, imagine if we had agreed to that.
Yeah.
We would have, imagine if today there's American engineers and scientists in North Korea helping to dismantle it, because it's not a year-long
Yeah.
process. That would take
Yeah.
forever. The entire region would be different,
Yes.
right? If we had that going. And the
Yeah.
American side, and I know most of the guys who were negotiating, oh, they wanted too much. It's like, we're not trading with them anyway, so pull a couple sanctions off. Who
Yeah.
cares, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I
the
know, but
world would be
my, my,
different.
my my sense also, I mean, this is anecdotal, that one of the key negotiators was John Bolton, and he was out to undermine the deal
Yes.
because he decided that any kind of reconciliation
Yeah.
with North Korea was not advisable, and so he undermined the deal. And this is where, in the first term, as you know, President Trump had very much less control among his lieutenants than in his second term.
Yeah.
Is that another reason why the deal failed also?
Yeah. I mean, most of the mainstream didn't want this deal anyway,
Uh-huh.
right? The ones who were willing to engage
Hmm.
thought the price was too high. But yes, most of DC still is very convinced, as you said, that we only talk to our friends, and until they become
Hmm.
friendly, we're going to ignore them.
Yeah.
And to me, that's, as you put it better than I did, but like, the whole point would be to trade
Yeah.
with North Korea, deal with them, and open them up,
Yeah.
and then see what'll happen.
Yeah.
So,
So let's now turn to President Trump's second term. And as you know, he's put higher tariffs on all three of them: China, Japan,
yeah,
South Korea. I wonder what the impact of these tariffs will be. And will, for example, South Korea and Japan realize that they now may have to find other trading partners, including
yeah,
China, to make up for lost American markets? Is that going to lead
yeah,
to closer just trading relationships or economic relationships
yeah,
between Japan and China and South Korea and China?
yeah. I think one of the first things that's happening is that there is the big question now that has to be asked, which is this temporary, or
Mm,
is this the way the world is going? Meaning the US is
mm,
no longer what we thought it was.
mm,
Because even under Biden, there were high tariffs on China. There was no real actual
mm,
economic policy towards the whole region, the entire Asian region.
mm.
That
Yeah.
IPEF was like 12 empty paragraphs of,
Mm.
the IPEF, what is it called? Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
think, or something like that, right?
yeah,
But it was just empty things about,
yeah,
green technology. There was nothing forward-leaning from the Biden
yeah.
administration. And then Trump has just taken that to the nth degree more.
Mm.
One thing I'll be interested to watch is, do the South Koreans get anywhere close to even keeping the level of investments in the United States that they already had, given the troubles that Hyundai had in Atlanta and things like that, right? The
Mm-hmm.
current deal, from what I understand from from people, talking to Koreans,
Mm-hmm.
they came up with a fact sheet about 33 billion this and 350 billion that. But much of that is left to be pushed to the future.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they're not really serious about it. And then much of that is relabeling stuff that's already going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So, this is because I think the Koreans are really beginning to wonder. And
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, somebody who has a lot of knowledge of Korean politics told me, I don't know, about a month or so ago, was like, for everything that's going on with Korea and China,
Mm-hmm.
basically we'll sell them stuff, they'll sell us stuff, and everything else is basically noise.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That Koreans realize that they have to have an economic relationship with China.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that the Japanese have been, also sort of forward leaning on what they're going to try and invest. But much of this, we have to wait and see what's going to happen because I don't see a future for, you can't take $350 billion out of the Korean economy or whatever the number is in Japan, like the similar number in Japan, and put it in the United States. I don't see how that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly that's a factor at play here. The
Yeah.
tariff in terms of the relations. But
Yeah.
now I think, maybe we should start moving towards the future,
Okay.
start thinking about how we can try and nudge these three countries towards free, free better sets of bilateral relationships among the three of them, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, Ezra Vogel reminded us that, out of the 1,500 years, the Chinese and Japanese live in peace for 1,450 years, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question, therefore, is how can we gradually, in this 21st century, it won't happen right away, but if we had to nudge China and Japan, Japan and South Korea, and South Korea and China towards more how do you say, positive relationships. What are the kind of small practical steps or
Yeah.
concrete steps you could try to recommend? And let's do one by one, each one of them. Okay, maybe we
Yeah.
start hopefully with what I think is the easiest one to fix, which is China, South Korea. How do we, what are the concrete things you think that can help to fix the China South Korean relationship?
Yeah. My sense of China, South Korea is that the relationship has gone through warmer and colder,
Hmm.
you know, times.
But I
But
find it depends also on the South Korean president.
yes,
The
well, yes.
left-wing presidents lean
Yeah.
towards cooperating with China. The right-wing presidents move closer to the US. So, for
Yes.
example, the downturn within China and South Korea under President Park's time was because of THAAD
Yeah.
from the US, for example.
Yeah.
So how? But nonetheless, I think maybe we can try to think of some concrete steps that can be taken to
Yeah.
help.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, the biggest issue there is clearly economic in nature.
hmm,
And both sides are trying to manage that, having gone from sort of symbolic sanctions and this, that, and the other thing under the THAAD.
hmm,
More Chinese tourists are back now in Korea. The trade is going back and forth in ways that there will
hmm,
always be bumps because there's
hmm,
commercial issues between companies.
hmm,
But I think the economic issue is fairly stable. I think the political relationship between China and Korea is actually fairly stable. And this is where, even though you get shifts in, depending on the Korean presidents,
hmm,
one thing that the Koreans, I think, are more aware of than the Japanese is they're not getting involved in things they view as Chinese.
hmm,
So Taiwan,
hmm,
Yoon Sung Yeol didn't get involved. When the American Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan,
yeah,
she went after that to Korea, and the president didn't even. There was no official one to meet her. The
really.
the Koreans stayed far away from that.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Because she
Um,
was toxic after going to Taiwan.
yeah, there was no way they were going to welcome her. So
Uh,
it was really difficult for the Korean president. But he
hmm,
was on vacation.
hmm,
Uh, No one officially met the plane.
Mm,
And then the next week, he sent his top national security advisor to China. So they
mm,
manage these things in ways that I think
mm, mm,
there will always be some issues, especially because of
mm.
North Korea.
Yeah. You
But
know,
those are issues that can be
yeah,
managed, I think,
yeah.
more than Japan, China.
No, which is interesting, the Japanese how do you say, foreign service is as large and as sophisticated as the South Korean foreign service.
Yeah,
But the South Koreans seem to be more adept at
yeah,
managing China and understanding Chinese sensitivities than the
yeah.
Japanese diplomats have been. So,
Yes.
for example, I'm sure if Nancy Pelosi had gone to Japan, she would have definitely met the
Oh,
Japanese
yes.
minister. But
Yes, they would have been right out there visiting her. And the Koreans know how to do it. I'll give you
yeah,
another story, which is sort of interesting. At the APEC summit in Busan a couple weeks
yeah,
ago,
yes,
Xi Jinping met Lee Jae-myung, the president,
uh,
and the Xi Jinping gave the Korean president as a gift a couple fancy
yeah,
cell phones, you
yes,
know, and you heard Lee Jae-myung joked about where's the back door,
yeah,
right? So they're close enough, they're comfortable enough to be able to joke about that kind of
yeah,
espionage
exactly,
stuff.
yeah.
But what often was missed, and this is the sort of cultural side,
Mm,
what was missed totally in the West was that then South Korean president made a reference to like the Warring States area in China, a story about
yeah,
the Chu general, et cetera, that Xi Jinping, everybody knew the story, and then Xi Jinping wrote back. So they were communicating to each other with a vocabulary that said, I
yeah,
understand how we get along.
yeah,
But
yeah,
only if you're Korean or only if you know this stuff would it even register what they were talking
yeah,
about,
yeah, yeah,
right? Because it was referencing an ancient Chu dynasty in
yeah,
2000 BC. And so they
yeah,
know how to get along.
yes. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Remembering a common history makes a big difference in the relation. So I
Yeah.
agree with you that of the three sets of relationships, the more easiest to, in some ways, stabilize would be the China-South Korean
Yeah.
relation. But now, if you have to turn to you would say the second least difficult relationship to fix, which is the Japan-South Korean relationship. What are the concrete steps both sides can take, you think?
Well, that one's more tricky because of course the Koreans feel aggrieved and the Japanese
Mm,
feel aggrieved in similar ways, right? I think usually the way that this is talked about is that the Koreans need to get over it.
mm,
Okay, at least I might be defensive, but that sort of appears
mm,
to me. People say,
yeah.
"Oh, the Koreans don't always bring it up. The Koreans always bring it up,"
Mm,
right? Um, and yet, there's just like with the joint patrols that Japan said we're not going to do. The
mm,
Japanese, in many ways, are just as stubborn on these
yeah.
kinds of disputed issues
Mm,
about the disputed territories. The Dokdo,
mm,
Takeshima, these kinds of things.
yeah.
And so both sides are sort of clinging to these issues
Mm,
in ways that make it very difficult. I think both Korean and Japanese societies are basically ready to move on, but
mm,
there are elements in both on the
mm,
right or the left that really cling to this
mm,
as an issue of their identity. And so it's hard to think what would be the issue or what would be the way forward. The one thing I can tell you that doesn't work is for
mm,
the presidents to go over there. They've tried this twice now for a president to go to Japan and say, this is done forever. We're never going to talk about it.
mm,
Right?
yeah.
It's a democratic society. So they tried that with comfort women, and then they
Yeah.
tried that with the Mitsubishi slave labor.
Yeah.
Um, and that failed miserably. The Korean populace is like, yes, we are going to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's
so I
true.
don't think you're going to resolve it up high. I think you resolve
Yeah.
it somehow, either by just letting it
Yeah.
go or socially.
Yeah. But there's also, I don't understand this, David. And I just touch on it briefly because the sense I have is that the Japanese-Korean cultural relationship is a neurotic one, and I'll explain why I think it's neurotic. On the one hand, the Japanese somehow rather believe that they're culturally superior to the
Mhm.
Koreans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why Koreans can almost never integrate fully into Japanese society because they're never really accepted as equals.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you in South Korea, I'm told privately they recognize that actually, in some ways, the Japanese era did um, spark South Korea's industrialization in some ways, you know. But you in South Korea, you never ever allowed to say anything at all positive about Japan. What
Yeah.
you do is you're committing suicide. So this neurotic relationship, how does one get out of that?
Yeah. It is one of the things that comes historically is that the Koreans
Yeah,
viewed themselves as much more civilized and advanced a society than the Japanese.
they do.
Okay, historically, that has been the case for centuries because they were closer to China, more sophisticated, calligraphy, and they sent more scholars, etc. So the Koreans at least viewed themselves as very high in the cultural ladder.
Mm,
Those ideas didn't spread as far in Japan,
mm,
right? So Koreans are used to being a
mm.
little looked down. At the last 100 years, though, 150 years, they were conquered by Japan, and the Japanese looked down on the Koreans,
Yeah.
which is, I think you're absolutely right. That the Japanese view the Koreans as being more, less westernized, more, less sophisticated, less, etc.
Mm,
So there's a mutual sort of disdain, in
mm,
a way, that sort of sifts through, along with obviously some admiration and envy
mm,
as well, right? And so, sort of culturally, there's still this competition
mm,
in ways that, I don't think you would have the same kind of thing between Koreans and Chinese.
mm. Yeah, that's right. My sense
Um,
is that
yeah,
in cultural terms, the Korean-Japanese relationship is much more neurotic than the Korean-Chinese relationship.
yeah, I would say so too. Yeah,
And that's a
yeah,
that's a challenge. So now we
yeah.
come to the most difficult one. The
Again, I have no
China-Japan,
answers. I
the
know. I'm sorry.
China-Japan relationship, because it to me very puzzling that it is one of the I found it's one of the most fragile relationships in the world, that it takes a lot of effort to keep it calm and stable. But all you need is one incident, and the whole
Yeah,
relationship just can get derailed. You know what I mean?
yeah,
There
yeah,
isn't there isn't any kind of tolerance for saying, hey,
yeah,
we will have mistakes and we just got to forgive and move
yeah,
on, kind of thing.
yeah. There's
But
no buffer zone there at
so
all. Yeah,
how there is an extra. It's almost as though the wounds from the Japanese occupation of China and World War II are still very raw,
yeah,
even though, frankly, now 80 years have passed since World War II ended.
yeah,
So why are those wounds still
yeah,
so raw in their relationship?
yeah. I think you know what's so interesting about that is like if you compare to Vietnam, which got invaded and all these, the
Yeah.
Vietnamese are much more magnanimous to
Mm.
to like Americans. They're not that bitter, even though they have all the reason to be very bitter, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and in China, I think part of this is that goes to this problem that China can't really address its history yet,
Mm.
right? That if you start to address what really happened in World War II or
Mm.
come to something, you're naturally asking the role of the CCP and the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution or KMT or whatever else,
Mm.
right? There's real issues there you have to deal with that very
Mm.
difficult to. And I also think that it's difficult for China. And this is one of the things I put in my in the article that I wrote with my two
Mm.
students. But it was like we think history's over. I mean, that's
Mm.
history, right? Come on, that was the Opium Wars from
Mm.
1841 or something like that.
Mm.
But if you were Chinese, Hong Kong was taken in 1841, but it only came back in 1997,
Mm.
right? So it's not like it was an 1841 thing.
Mm.
That's 1997 before you can
Yeah,
close the books on
yeah,
that part of the unequal treaties or that part of the
yeah,
century of humiliation.
yes,
And much of Taiwan is still part of the 1895 century of humiliation from
yes,
Japan.
yes, yes.
Right. And so that is, I actually, that's part of the reason that Taiwan is such a sore point for the Chinese, which is it was
Yeah,
the, you've read like
yeah,
Li Hongzhang and what he said in 1895 was, don't take this, Japan, because it will cause problems between our countries forever.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, and it's true, right? So
yeah,
Taiwan isn't just Taiwan. Taiwan is Japan caused Taiwan issues.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
very hard to put a bow and say, oh, well, come on, that was 100 years ago. No, it
Yeah,
wasn't,
yeah,
right? Which is not necessary to defend Chinese per se, but that's why the Chinese are the way they are. Japanese are in some ways saying, well, come on, just move on. We want to go to the future, but without saying, we actually caused the whole Taiwan problem, right?
yeah. That's right. I mean, this. I'm glad you mentioned the century of humiliation because I do think, by the way, as an aside, U.S.-China relations would be better managed if every American negotiator with China at least studied the century of humiliation,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
then they could make sure that they didn't sort of sort of step on wounds that are still open. I mean, this is
Yeah.
where, for example, I give you a concrete example when Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan decided to give moral lectures to China and Alaska. I thought, my God, they don't seem to
Yeah.
know the history at all. It's very
Yeah.
sad,
Yeah.
very, very sad.
Yes. Just
Whereas
unbelievably arrogant.
in
Yeah.
East Asia, history is very much alive.
Yeah.
And the challenge for Northeast Asia is how to overcome that history. But I'm very glad you mentioned Vietnam, earlier on. Because what's interesting about Vietnam is that Vietnam is culturally closer to Northeast Asia
Yeah.
than to Southeast Asia. But geographically, it is in Southeast Asia. And it has integrated with Southeast Asia. And many people are not aware that when I was ambassador to the UN for 10 years, for 4.5 years, from 84 to 89, I spent every day fighting the Vietnamese ambassador over the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia.
Yeah.
As soon as
Yeah.
the occupation was over, Singapore and Vietnam became good friends immediately,
Yeah.
almost immediately. So in Southeast Asia, the Indonesians have injected what I call the spirit of musyawara and mufakat, which are two Javanese words which mean consultation and consensus.
Hmm.
And here, on a closing note, I do believe that all three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, should come to Southeast Asia to try and understand how, through consultation and consensus, you gradually erode the weight of history, you see, which is what we have done, because
Yeah.
there's lots of histories of bilateral disputes among Southeast Asian countries too. And I
Yeah.
mean, by the way, even to today, Philippines claims a state in Malaysia. It is
I
bizarre.
didn't know
It
that.
is
Yeah, I didn't
bizarre.
know
It's
that. Yeah.
bizarre, but we carry on normal relationships.
Yeah.
So we are able to overcome history. So do you think, on a concluding note, what are the sort of lessons you think Northeast Asia can learn from Southeast Asia?
Dealing with history involves, in some ways, being willing to say that was awful, and yet I'm going to move on.
Mm.
Right. And I think in Southeast Asia, they've done that more than they have in Northeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because you're never going to get complete closure or the tremendous ending and tying a bow on the top of some things were awful and there's no getting around it. And you still have to live with people and get on with them
Mm-hmm.
in a new era. And I think ASEAN has done a great job. I'm a big fan of ASEAN and what's going on, right? I mean, there's been real progress there, and we don't see that in Northeast Asia, not as much.
Yes. Yeah. Well, like, as you know, from time to time, when the Japanese and Chinese leaders can't talk to each other, the place where they break their ice is to come to an ASEAN meeting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's what
exactly.
they've done.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyway, but thank you very much, David. This
Thank you for having me.
conversation has been very wide-ranging. I think it sort of has reminded us that if we want to move ahead into the future in a comfortable fashion, we first have to understand the history, especially the
Yes.
history in the relationship between China and Japan, South Korea and Japan, and South Korea and Japan too. So I hope that our podcast has given our listeners a deeper insight into uh, why we still have the problems in this region. I want to close by thanking you, David. And I want to also add that the Asian Peace Talks podcast is produced by Dr. Varikonda Kesavachandra and Ms. Kristen Tang and released by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.